with you and sharing more about design thinking methodology and some foundations of innovation. I'm going to try and share my screen now to see if this works. Is my screen visible? Elena, is it okay? Do you see it? Let me. Great. Okay. So, before I begin, a few words about my background. So my name is Anastasia. I am from Greece. I've recently graduated from the Faculty of Electrical and Computer Engineering with a specialty and an interest especially for biomedical technology, and especially how to use artificial intelligence in disease management and diagnostics. In parallel, I've initiated my entrepreneurial career by co-founding Ideate, which is a baby tech startup. We have created an application that translates the baby's cry and associates it with its different needs. Why the baby's crying? Is it hungry? Is it sleepy? Is it in pain? And we managed to win the second place out of 3,000 teams in Microsoft's biggest innovation and technology competition, Imagine Cup, back in 2018. And now we are continuing developing our product to be able to release it in the market. In parallel, I've been a strong advocate about STEM accessibility. STEM stands for science, technology, engineering, and math. And I'm using as a medium to achieve that science communication and innovation. Specifically, last November, I participated in a big innovation lab hosted by the United Nations in Shenzhen, China, where we had to create a project on how to bring the STEM field especially closer to women. This is my general background, and I'm going to talk to you more about the design thinking methodology, because it was this methodology, I was first acquainted with it during EYP, but I didn't know back then that the things we were doing during committee work and General Assembly and discussing and creating solutions were actually based on this methodology. So let's start with what is innovation. There have been many definitions. I really like this one by Paul Sloan, who is an author about innovation. He says that creativity is thinking of something new and useful. Innovation is the implementation of something new and useful. So innovation brings creativity to life. And I especially want to stress the usefulness part, because nowadays people just want to create new things just for the sake of being innovative. But if this thing they're creating, this product, this service is not useful to someone, then it does not fulfill its purpose. So what is innovation? When we think about innovation, we may think about more conventional things like, you know, the discovery of electricity, the discovery of cars. But innovation was when Amazon totally revolutionized the way we deliver, the way products are delivered, the way we buy products, or when Apple revolutionized what it means to have design integrated in smart devices. There have been actually more than 10 types of innovation, and usually most startup mentors and experts suggest that each startup has at least 2 or 3 types of innovation integrated within its core. A startup or project can be innovative in terms of how it makes money, of its profit model, of its business model. It can be innovative on the processes it uses, on the networks and the channels it leverages, can be innovative on the product itself and its performance, but can also be innovative on how it uses its brand to have an impact. I invite you to look further about these 10 types of innovation, because it really gives more insight on what we do consider innovative. So I'm going to initiate an interactive part of this webinar and ask you to write on the chat some characteristics of people whom you think are innovators. So I'm waiting for your responses in the chat. What does a person who is an innovator has to have as a characteristic, as a trait? I see motivation, ability to bring people together. Definitely innovation requires teamwork, creativity to be able to think outside the box, vision to have like a bigger picture of what he wants to achieve. Definitely resourcefulness, because it's very difficult to raise funds and other resources. Thank you all for your answers. Imagination, determination. I think you've covered most of it. Generally, an innovator is someone who is not afraid to step out of his comfort zone and take risks, to discover and look in multiple ideas and embrace change and mistakes. He wants to have an impact. That's why we talked about creating something useful. But most of all, I think what I really want to stick at your minds is that innovator can be anyone. But why design thinking? So design thinking is a methodology that has been developed the last couple of 30 or 40 years, but has been implemented the last 20 years. And it's a way to deal with unknown and ill-defined problems, the problems of the newest generation, in a more human-centric way, putting in the center the person, the user, and its needs. It's a way into looking at products and services based on their desirability, what the user and the person who will be affected wants, viability, and I mean about financial viability, is it something that can become a business, and feasibility, is it technically, can be technically implemented. It's a process that is based on multiple iterations. It matches the non-sequential and non-linear reality that we're all facing, and it encourages learning by making. So far, the big companies and the multinational companies were following the waterfall model, which means that I'm doing wonders and I'm creating the best product, I'm refining it and making it the best possible technically and user experience wise, and then I'm dropping it into the market. But when I drop it into the market, it has been so long for this process to happen that the market no longer wants it. So design thinking encourages us to not be afraid to do rapid prototyping and rapid testing, so that we are always connected with the market and the user's needs. And most of all, it is a thought process, not only a methodology, which can be implemented into whatever aspect of your life. If it's not entrepreneurship, in project management, even in EYP, we do like a small simulation of design thinking methodology. And I've listed some resources that you can further look on. The design kit. There is the Tim Brown, who is a pioneer in design thinking, has a blog. The design thinking bootleg book from Stanford, and also some of the methods that I'm going to describe are based on Deloitte's innovation process. So this is the overview of the design thinking process. Let's say that you want to tackle a problem. You know that something bothers you. So the first step with this process would be to empathize. This means to get into the shoes and look through the eyes of the person who is affected by this problem, to understand the context, the motivations, the needs of the user, to really immerse yourself in this experience. And based on all these observations, then you will be more equipped to define the problem clearly. Because you had, at the beginning, you had a sense of what you're trying to solve, but now that you have been immersed in this experience, you have identified with specific scope of the problem you want to tackle. And after having that definition, then you move to ideation, which is the process where you start brainstorming about the solutions and the different ideas that can bring to life and tackle the problem. And instead of following the example and the paradigm of the big companies that ideate endlessly and work on making the best product, which takes a while, design thinking encourages us to do the ideation together with the prototyping and testing very quickly. So once you have come down, narrowed down to specific ideas, then you do some rapid prototyping and throw it into the market, get some feedback, and then go back again to refining your project. And as you see, there are arrows from the testing phase that go back to ideation, because your feedback may lead you into different ideas, that go back to definition, because the feedback you get from your users may even lead you to redefine the original problem, or back to empathy, because you will further understand and sense your users. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to explain phase by phase, giving a bit more details on what happens, and also giving you some examples of the methods you can use to implement in each phase. I encourage you to write questions in the chat for each phase, and I'm going to take a small pause after each phase to answer specific questions so that I don't bore you with this whole webinar and it's only me talking all the time. So let's start with the empathize phase. So let's say that you and your team want to help someone, okay? You have seen something that bothers you, that affects you, or if not you, some other target group that causes harm, something that is missing or needs improvement. And you would say, well, what kind of problem is that? It could be a problem that is related with your sector or industry, with your area of expertise, so you're more familiar with it. A problem that is perhaps more relevant to your skill set, or a problem that, or if you just want to save the world and trying to find big problems to have an impact, you can look at the research grants and research questions that Europe raises and gives funding for. So now that you have a sense of what you're trying to solve, let's say for my startup, it was that we want to help parents better take care of their babies. The next step is for you to understand the culture, to understand the context, the motivations and aspirations of your users. For our case, for instance, we weren't parents. We don't have any experience with taking care of babies or what do they need. So it was very, very crucial for us to actually talk with parents, engage and interact with them and understand their daily lives and their struggles. At this stage, it is very important to set aside your own assumptions, forget everything you know about the problem, and do a lot of research. And it's secondary research, which means you look online, on Google, you read papers, you read journals, you see videos, documentaries, and primary research, which is the most important, where you go on the field and take interviews and speak with your users and observe, engage, and immerse in their own reality to have a better sense of the whole problem. So let's see some examples of methods you can use for this stage. First of all, before doing your interviews with the user, it is very important to be prepared. Try to brainstorm the different questions you want to ask them and perhaps categorize them under themes. But also don't narrow it down very specifically and be open-minded to listen to what the user has to say, because he may open up perspectives that you hadn't thought of before. So don't feel pressed to guide completely the discussion, but rather have a preparation so that you're sure that by the end of the interview, you have all the information you need. And a good way to organize your notes during these interviews is using the what, how, why. So what does your user say? This is just stating plainly the fact, what he said. How has this experience made your user feel? So for instance, for us, when we were talking about parents, the user would say to me, the mother, that when the baby is crying, everyone around the house is alarmed. So both the mother and the father are trying to see what is happening. And as I'm asking, how does this make them feel? They would say that this is a very negative experience because they feel stressed. They feel that perhaps their baby is having something that they don't understand, or it's sick, or they need to call the doctor. And when I'm asking the why, it's only the little part that perhaps you are allowed to make an assumption. I would say that the mother and the father feel that way because, number one, they love their baby so much, so they want to take care of it. Perhaps number two, if they're in in an outdoor setting. They feel also the social pressure of other people looking at them and discussing that they're not good enough parents. So by doing your notes in this way, you can have them in a more structured way. Encourage stories during interviews, because people, when they're telling stories, it's easier to get into some other details that perhaps you hadn't thought about. And pay attention to nonverbal cues and their body language and what things causes them what kind of emotions. Don't suggest answers when you're asking. A great book that I'm always recommending when it comes to talking with your users or interacting with people, so that you limit the bias from their opinions, is the Mom Test book. It's a very easy read, and it suggests on how you can get feedback without you being suggestive of the kind of feedback you want. This part is perspectives. And another method that usually, sometimes when we don't have enough data, we use is analogous empathy, which means that we are speaking with users that have similar problems, not exactly the same, and trying to find patterns between these two categories. So for instance, let's say if we didn't find enough parents, we perhaps could talk to grandparents, or we perhaps could talk to baby care facilitators and no, people who work at baby care facilities, and on an extra step, perhaps with pet owners, and what do they do when they want to know what their dog or cat is barking or meowing. So analogous empathy is used also to find some patterns in similar target groups. So that's the part from empathy. Add or something that wasn't clear. I'm watching the chat if there is anything. Okay, I'm gonna move on, and if anyone has any question, please write it down, and I will address it later on. So now we have done our empathy, we have immersed ourselves in this experience, and we move on to the definition. So now that we have collected all this data and observation, it's time to analyze it and synthesize them to define the core problem. So on the first step, we set aside our own assumptions and focus on what the user needs. This step is how we ourselves have understood the user's point of view. So this is our own point of view, and is using. So insight, and the difference of an insight with a fact, is a friction or a dilemma, which is the primary barrier to mitigate this challenge. So for instance, in our startup, an insight would be that babies use their cries to communicate their needs, and this is in friction with parents not understanding how the cry can be interpreted. So this is the main challenge, how that the babies talk their own language and parents are speaking a totally different language, and these two languages cannot converge. So once you look into the different insights of the problems you are tackling, then you have an actionable problem statement on which you can start working on. And methods you can use for this process is that during the empathy phase, you have gathered all your data and observations, and you can do some user profiling. So for instance, I have a mother, let's say one mother named Mary, and I've written down what she said, okay, what she did, what are her actions, what did she thought, how did she feel, and then I also write down what I think are her needs, what are her wants. Sometimes needs and wants are very different things, and what kind of impact I want to have in her lives. So once I've done this user profiling, I can see some patterns emerging on what are the total user's needs and wants. And taking a next step, I'm mapping their journey. So for instance, for our case, it would be the journey of what happens when the baby is crying. So I had written down for mother number one that the first thing she would do would be to take her baby into her arms and trying to console it with swinging it back and forth. Then she would try to feed it. If the baby couldn't be fed, then she would try to put it in sleep. And I'm mapping out the whole journey, and I'm doing the same with every parent. Perhaps some parents just call the doctors the first thing that they do. Other parents may play some music. But at some point when I have mapped a lot of journeys, I can see some patterns emerging. So some things that all the users are doing similarly. And this gives me an indication um, towards also the idea I want to create and how will this be incorporated into their daily routines. Another thing to really define what kind of problem you're trying to solve is to build a problem framing tree. This means that you start with the big question, the why, and then you keep going deeper by asking why, who, and how. So our case again would be parents understand why their baby is crying. Why? Because one branch would be because they're inexperienced parents. It's their first baby. Another branch would be why? Because there is no glossary on what the baby's cry is supposed to mean. Another question would be why? Because they are deaf. They cannot hear. And then I'm going into each branch and I'm going one step deeper. So why there is no glossary for baby's cry? Because no one has studied it, let's say. Or why? Because no one has accumulated the existing research into an easy tool for the parents. So once you do this problem framing tree, then as a team you can choose which branch you want to focus on and which specific scope of the problem you want to deal with to get deeper and start ideating on. So for us, when we built the tree, the branch we wanted to target was that there is no objective tool for cry recognition right now. We said that this is a problem we want to solve. And for the team to have it clear in their minds, it would be to frame a sentence: user needs to, users need, because your insight. And in our case would be young, inexperienced parents need to have an objective tool for cry recognition because, in our insight, babies cry to communicate their needs, but the parents don't understand that cry. And this was our problem framed and ready to be ideated on. Do you have any questions on that section before I move on with ideation? Have the idea for app before empathizing? Oh, that's a very interesting question. So yes, actually, the idea of creating a tool to do the cry translation was before the empathizing phase, because we approached it from a signal processing background. So we were all engineers, really excited about using technology to have an impact in people's lives. And I was especially researching more about the information that can be hidden and compressed into signals, or specifically audio signals. So our professor with whom we were cooperating suggested that we look further into it in a technological point of view. But once we started looking at it more technically, we couldn't find our motivation or our vision on what we wanted to create before empathizing, because we were like, okay, and what is the big deal of parents not knowing why the baby is crying? They can try feeding it, they can try, you know, putting it to sleep. Why would they stress that much? Because we didn't have that experience. So after the empathizing phase, it was when we realized how important it was for parents, even just for their own mental health and well-being, to be able to promptly and properly respond to their baby's cry. So it was a phase that, although happened to us in retrospect, it was really crucial and important, and really gave us the motivation to move on with the project. Thank you for the question, Prodrome. And now let's move on to ideation. So we have defined our problem. We know that what we want to create, and now it's the time that is very well known from UIP as well, is the brainstorming brainstorming time of what and design thinking methodology suggests that this process fluctuates between times of flair and times of focus. So the ultimate goal is to have a large quantity and broad diversity of ideas with which we can create different prototypes to later test. So we need to be able to have open minds and create and write down as many ideas as possible, not limiting ourselves based on the resources or based on what is feasible at this point, but just brainstorm and be creative, because these are the ideas that will be the foundation of our, and their synthesis will be the result of this process. But sometimes it also, when you start brainstorming very widely, you can easily get lost. So there need to be times of focus, and this can be done with temporary constraints. So for instance, we started brainstorming on ways with which this product would be created. It could be an application on the phone, it could be a hardware device, it could be incorporated inside a teddy bear. So when we started talking about applications, we then add the temporary constraints. So what if this family and these parents don't have Wi-Fi? How would that work? And then we started brainstorming how would that work without Wi-Fi? What if this family, let's say, is a family of hearing impaired parents? How would that work? And we started brainstorming on how that works. So that's adding temporary constraints and giving you a little bit of focus so you don't lose yourself in the chaos. Again, this is a process that has to be done with the whole team to have a broader perspective. And this is something that we are also taught in EYP. There is no idea evaluation or judgment. Everyone is free to suggest whatever he wants. And then there will be some later on grouping based on specific parameters. So methods to do, I'm not gonna elaborate on brainstorming techniques because we know a ton of them from EYP as well. And it was actually quite surprising for me how many things I've learned from EYP. I actually had a chance to implement them in the startup. Something that really helps is to visualize and sketch your ideas on paper and not only explain them with words, especially for products. And a way to move from the brainstorming to the grouping part is to enforce theory of change in your different ideas. So if this happens, then this will happen, and that will be the result. This is a way to see how your ideas can have an impact. And then you can on their desirability, as we said, how much the user wants it, the feasibility, if it's financial feasible, viability, the feasibility if it's technically feasible, viability if it is financially viable, and an axis of value versus complexity, how impactful it is versus how complex it is to be created, and perhaps map them on the needed resources and stakeholders. So once you've done this whole map and you have a bunch of ideas, as a team, you have to choose with which 2 or 3 you're gonna focus on and start building your prototypes. You can write on the chat as well any questions, if you have any questions about this section of ideation. Although I think we're all pretty familiar with this section. It's something that happens in many professional environments as well. And after that stage comes prototyping. So this is the stage where you want to bring these ideas into life at some form to test them with your users. And that's when we experiment with what we say is the minimum viable product. This is an inexpensive, scaled down version of the product you have in mind, or of specific features and functionalities of your product, in a physical form, so that is very interactive, and that you can test with your users. So it can be anything as far as form is concerned. It can be from a wall of post-its in its most simple form to a role-playing activity or an object. And it's a way for you to share and communicate your vision and deepen your understanding of your users and of the problem. So for us, in our case, our prototypes were, when it comes to designing the user interface and user experience, we just use some mock-ups. So like images of how we envisioned this application that we shared with our users to get some feedback on that. And then we understood that they wanted something a bit more functional, so we created some small applications that would simulate the cry translation process and shared these applications, but they were like very ugly. So nothing very fancy, just to test the basic functionality. Or when it comes to investors who want to see your product before they funding and you don't have enough funding to complete it, we had hardwired our own application that you press the button and it gave you the translation result immediately, because we wouldn't be possible to bring babies in our investor meetings and have the babies crying and the investors checking if the app works. And all they wanted to check was actually how it functions, how it is as a product. So when it comes to prototyping, sketch, play, simulate, use scenes, use roles with your users. In the innovation lab in China, where we proposed an educational framework to bring the STEM field closer to women, in order to showcase that to investors, we had to create a role-playing activity where the investors had to pretend to be the little girls, and we were supposed to be the facilitators of this framework so that they could understand and experience how the final product would look like. It's very important also to know what you want to test. Don't test on the same time multiple elements of your final product, but perhaps break it down to discrete elements. And in order to choose what things and features you want to test, be guided by your own assumptions. So what is the main uncertain thing you want to test? For us, for instance, would the parents be willing to, when the baby starts crying, pick up their phone instead of first picking up their child and trying to do whatever traditionally they were trying to do? So this was a main assumption we had to test. We had to test how the technology intervening in this relationship would affect the balance. So prioritize your assumptions and choose wisely what kind of things you want to test. And your prototype, as I said before, doesn't have to be perfect. It could work like the original product, look like it, be made like it. It could be like a Wizard of Oz prototype. Wizard of Oz prototype is the one I also described to you with investors. It means that it showcases how the functionality is without actually working. So you have already set it up behind. And something that is now getting more attractiveness is the user-driven prototyping, which can be seen by this whole wave of crowdsourcing and crowd making different platforms, that you ask your users what do they want to see as a prototype, or what kind of functionality they would like to test and experiment. So this is all about prototyping. Feel free to write your questions in the chat once more. Oh, great. In light of the current situation, do you have experience with digital prototyping? Can it work without having something physical to play around with? Perfect. So thank you for your question. Okay, for digital products, it's easy because the prototypes are digital tools. It could be a simple app you could create with many app making platforms and softwares. It could be, as we said before, mockups and presentations. It could be even like a web service that mimic some functionalities. With physical products, what I have seen happening, for instance, I have a friend who has a board game startup. So he wanted to test his board game, and with the quarantine and everything, it was very hard to organize play tests. So what he did was he created a version of his board game that was print and play. So he shared it online, and then people could download the files, print it, build the board game and test it. So something that could be done with physical products, or something else, it would be if you could ship and deliver some products to your testers, if they could imitate some functionalities of your product with other products they might already have at their houses, and you giving them instructions. It's definitely a bit harder to do at this time, but there are still ways. Now let's move on to testing. So testing is an iterative process. It doesn't happen only once. You constantly create prototypes, give them to people, gather feedback, refine and change your solutions, give them back to people, and you continue to learn and test your assumptions. So testing, as we saw at the original overview, links back to ideation, back to definition, or even back to empathy. Something very interesting about testing is what happens when your user tests the product without you being present and you later on gathering feedback with follow-up questions, or what happens when you're in front of your user interacting and engaging with your product, which is also, it gives you more information about the nonverbal cues, as we said, the body language, and it can give you also very interesting insights. But what is a bit dangerous with this situation would be that when you're observing your user, make sure you're not correcting him or guiding him on how to use the product, because in this way you're losing a lot of valuable feedback. So how do we organize before testing? Before we get into a testing phase, we need to write down what are the main assumptions and questions we want to test. So for us, as I said before, it would be that parents are eager to grab their phone when their baby is crying, one assumption. A second assumption would be that parents would trust what an application would say to them, and etc. Many assumptions. Under each assumption, you are writing down the methodology and the specifics with which you're going to test them, okay? And then under that, you're writing the metrics and the success criteria with which you're going to evaluate how did this testing go. For instance, when we had to do some testing rounds with potential investors and partners, some metrics and success criteria would be the number of users engaging daily with your product, how many times each user visits your product or uses your app, and these metrics and criteria differ as far as the product and the service is concerned. And then on the last row, you're writing your findings, what happened after the testing, what did you learn, and how are you going to respond to that, okay? What are you going to do with the things you've learned? During the testing, it's great to target your main users and interact with them. For us, we did our main testing with parents, but we also tested our product with doctors, with baby care, with people working at baby care facilities and caretakers, because when you get the broader target groups or the expert groups, you can expand your viewpoint and have a more holistic perception of how your product actually fits in. And a way to capture feedback if you're observing your user interacting with your product is to create a cross, and on the one corner write down the things that the user seems to like or notice. On the other corner, the constructive criticism. On the other corner, the questions raised while he was interacting and the new ideas perhaps spurred through this interaction. And then make sure to synthesize all that feedback and make the appropriate changes to your prototype to test it again. So be mindful towards your changes, because at the beginning, we also, when one parent said that, for instance, let's say one parent said that he hates the yellow color of the background of the app, we were like, oh my God, we really have to change that. Let's try another color. Let's try blue or green. But if it's only one parent that bothers that, who is bothered by that, and all the other parents don't seem to notice it, then perhaps this is not a change worth taking. And this is like a very stupid example, but some changes perhaps would require you having more resources or more funding. So be mindful towards the changes you make and make sure that they are within, let's say, the majority of your users' liking. If you have any questions about testing as well, I'm open. Okay, and so that was the last phase of the design thinking methodology. Not exactly the last, because as we said, the loop goes on. So after testing, you prototype again and test again and again until you are satisfied. And once you are satisfied by the product and you know what you want to do, then it's the implementation roadmap. And this is the last phase, let's say, where now you and your team have your problem framed. You take a big piece of paper, you write down your problem, you write down your solution, and what is the ultimate vision Okay, so for us, our ultimate vision would be that every parent around the world has I Cry to Talk in their phones, at least for the first year being parents. And then you are creating a timeline. You can start with a yearly timeline and set goals in this timeline and map them on this timeline with crucial milestones. What do you want to achieve until when? So let's say for us, it would be like, let's say by March, we want to have 1,000 cries in our database in collaboration with doctors. By July, we would want to have UI and UX, user interface and user experience, all sorted out, etc. And once you have your goals and your milestones, or your timeline, write down under its milestone what would be the major obstacles from achieving that milestone, and what would be the main activities that that have to be done to achieve those. And with the activities, be like super detailed, write any activity, any task and subtask required to reach that goal, so that you can have a clear overview of what needs to be done. And under its activity, write down the resources, the capital, and the stakeholders needed to achieve it, as well as the assumptions that are relevant to this activity and that perhaps you need a bit more testing before getting it into the market. And then you go and look into your team, something that you hopefully have done before this whole process. You have analyzed what are the competencies and the personality traits of your team members, if they're passionate, what is their attitude like, are they flexible, are they open-minded, what are their skills, hard skills and soft skills, are they complementing each other, what is their vision, are they here because they want to see the startup reaching its end goal, or are they just here to gain some experience, which is also something valid. And then based on those things of your team, assume roles and responsibilities linked with the previous activities and goals, and check if there's something still needed or something still missing. Something that works, that needs to be, that needs to exist with every team is an accountability system, as followed with an organizational structure and system. Even in very small teams, even in teams with your friends, there have to be clear boundaries so that everything runs smoothly, so that everyone knows what is its role and where to find anything. There are a bunch of very useful digital tools for organizational, like Trello, Slack, Asana for more developers products. There is Geek Robot. There are a bunch of tools, I'm sure you know even more, which can help with all that. And with that, this is the end of my presentation. I hope that this gives you an extra push to go outside and innovate and use all these tools to think of disruptive solutions and products and services. Thank you. I'm going to stop sharing now so we can have a discussion with the time remaining. Can you hear me?
Guys, do we have any questions or comments?
Okay, so Alan asks for the team forming approach. For the Imagine Cup, how did you form your team? Good question. So for us, we were three students and my faculty, all electrical and computer engineers. One of these students was a very close friend of mine. The other was just a student who we hang out a lot, and he was also very passionate and had the same interests. So we formed our team kind of on a let's say a bit arbitrarily, because we just wanted to do some sort of project that would give us a more practical aspect of our field. But later on, having founded a bit randomly our team, we realized some underlying problems and things that we had to solve before founding our own startup, because it's a different thing to work on a project and very different to start a business with someone. I would say that when you're choosing your business partners, the major key points is to be all on the same page as far as the vision of the startup is concerned, of your project. How do you see it? What is the main goal you have? Is it to have social impact? Is it to make a lot of money? Is it to have a big buyout and go on with your lives? Or is it to, let's say, give your whole lives for this project? So it's very important that all the founding members of the team have the same vision on that. And it's also very important that everyone respects each other, and there is some sort of hierarchy, if not bottom up, at least there is an horizontal hierarchy where someone is in charge of the more technical stuff, someone is in charge of the more operational or the business ones, because that gives everyone the space to use its skills and develop and grow. And yeah, I would say vision and having clear roles and responsibilities, and of course having the same work ethics. So you cannot work with someone who does not have the same core values. So for instance, for us, it would be that we have to be very flexible, we have to be very respectful, we have to be open-minded, and have to do things that had impact, if that answers your question. But the initial formation was a bit random, but then we had to change things up a bit. And where are all the team members now? So we're all together still. We're all working, yes, on the project. It was a bit tricky because we were all at the end of our studies and had to take important decisions of what we want to do with our careers. But since we were all very stoked and motivated by the project, we still continue it a bit more part-time, I would say, not full-time, because right now we are in negotiations with partners and clients, which takes a lot of time. It's not product development anymore, it's more about business, and business takes a while with the bureaucracy and the pandemic as well. So right now we're all working on it a bit more part-time, and yeah. Okay, so someone asks, the design thinking process seems to be centered on solving problems. How do you think the same process could be adapted to more creative tasks? Great question. Actually, the design thinking methodology was first developed, if I'm not mistaken, in a way to bring more creativity in the more sterile mathematical problem-solving methods that existed, because it involves this whole the part of empathy, which is very very crucial for any creative activity as well. When you want to create something, you need to be able to connect with the surroundings and the environment and the people around you from whom you draw inspiration. And also it involves rapid prototyping, which is also something very common in creative tasks, because you never come up just with a perfect design on the spot. You have to create multiple things and tweak and refine, and until you are happy with your end result. So I don't think it's a process that is more tailored on, like, let's say, solving problems in an entrepreneurial way, but generally it's the thought process of you get inspired by what happens around you, you create, you define your own point of view on this matter, you ideate on it, to you test some things, and then you keep getting feedback from the environment and you refine things around it. So it's more about a thought process rather than a mathematical approach or an equation in solving something. And I'm sure I'm not an expert on the field. I've only used it on the entrepreneurial environment, but there are a great deal of resources you can look further to see how to implement in different scenarios. Wow, many questions. So how long was the whole development process? What was the biggest obstacle while working? So because we started for a competition, we had deadlines on the competition, and we started in September 2017 doing our research, and on November we were finalized on what we wanted to create, And then we had to have a working prototype by the end of May. So we had like around 6 months stop to have something. I think the biggest obstacle was finding cries, labeled cries, because our algorithms mimic the way the parent's brain learns. So you listen to a lot of cries, and at some point you know what is happening, because you also know that, let's say if you're a parent, you know the schedule, and you understand the non-verbal cues and the body language of your baby. But the algorithms have to be trained on cries that have been medically validated. So we had to collaborate with hospitals and doctors and go and spend 4 or 5 hours a day recording cries of babies crying because they were vaccinated, or babies crying because they were hungry, or babies crying before they were going to bed. So that was the biggest struggle, because at the same time, while doing this every day, we had to do some software development and everything. And it's also pretty hard to infiltrate in the health system without having approvals and other bureaucratic things. So that was the biggest obstacle. And after the competition, where we had the prototype, we were working for 1 year in a startup incubator, fully developing the product, building our business model, because we are all engineers. We knew nothing about business. We had to learn everything in 1 year. And yeah, so right now our product has reached the desired developed phase before partnering with a client, because we are going towards a B2B approach. We will partner with a baby product company that will release the product for free for parents, because that was our main goal, that every parent could have this application for free, but we also had to find a way to be financially viable. So it's taken us for 1.5 years at least, this whole process. When you were fundraising by the startup, did you use anything learned in EYP? Also, how did you approach finding investors, fundraising in general? Yes, fundraising in EYP. Definitely, I would say EYP has helped us a lot on pitching and doing public speaking, because when you're talking with investors, you have to pitch your idea, you have to do your defense speech and inspire your investors. For us, because we were building a software program, we didn't have a lot of, let's say, costs related to manufacturing or hardware. Mainly, the main costs for us is the platforms, the cloud platforms, and our own salaries, let's say, for our own survival as engineers. So we bootstrapped the whole thing with our own money. We paid for everything, for our expenses, for the marketing costs and business trips and conventions. And we used also the money coming from awards, from competitions. We participated in 2-3 competitions, innovation competitions that had prize money, and we used that money to bring it back to the product. And we were talking with a lot of venture capitals and investors that give you some money and take a part of equity. But we decided not to go with this funding option because it felt a bit limiting towards our vision and how we wanted to keep the main equity of our product. And so far it has worked out well. And right now we're negotiating for a deal that would make us financially viable and sustainable to keep developing our product. Okay. Any other question?
So if not, guys, thank you for this great debate and lots of questions, interesting questions indeed. Thank you, Anastasia, for sharing this, your great story of how you already at this young age built up your own startup, your own project. This story definitely motivates now all of us in the times of isolation and not being able to do much. So thank you for agreeing on jumping on this opportunity and motivating us all. And thank you for sharing this great idea on the innovative approach to how to change things.
Thank you. Thank you for listening and for taking the time and discussing with me.
Yes, so guys, thank you for joining and wish you a great Easter break to all of you who will celebrate now or celebrate later. Yeah, we will have another webinar next week on 15th of April, and that one will be with two UIP alumni who are working in the Dutch embassy in Baghdad, and they would like to share their story, how they got in the diplomacy field. So feel free to join. And yes, Anastasia, enjoy the nice weather in Greece, and hope to see you at the alumni reunion, in case if that will take place.
All right, in Poland, is it right?
Yes, in Warsaw. So if it takes place, then this year in Warsaw. If not, then at the other alumni reunion.
Hope that too.
Yeah, I see a comment from Anastasia. We want more webinars. I will work my magic. But because we have so many active alumni like Anastasia also, I'm sure that we will have a lot.
For sure.
Bye-bye, guys.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.